Hello everyone, and welcome to this AsiaEdit Author Success webinar. I'm Trevor Lane, an education consultant at AsiaEdit. I've been helping authors, editors, and publishers to publish research in peer-reviewed academic journals for the past 25 years, and I'm a trained English teacher. In this webinar, I'll provide you with some strategies for preparing your work for submission to international journals, focusing on the correct style of English. In this hour, we'll cover what international journals are looking for in submissions, the features of written English expected by international journals, and my top tips for writing research articles. The final 10 to 15 minutes will be reserved for a Q&A question and answer session, where I'd be more than happy to answer your questions about manuscript writing. First, a quick word about Zoom features. To make the webinar interactive, I'll be asking you to use the Zoom raise hand button and to type in the chat box. But to ask a question for the Q&A session at the end, please type into the question box at any time or during the Q&A session itself. So the first section is on what do international journals actually want. And I would like you first to type in the chat box a few words for what you think makes an international journal. What does a journal look for, and what makes a journal international? So type in the chat box what you think international means. I'll give you a few seconds. So it could be in English, yes. It could be disseminated worldwide, so widespread readership, yes. Now here's some items I thought of. International journals are going to be indexed in international indexes. So these are general academic ones like Scopus and Web of Science that you would have heard of, and also the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, and I'm a council member of COPE. So that accepts journals of all different languages, all different disciplines, to show that they are ethical and have international standards. For open access journals, which are free for readers, there's the Directory of Open Access Journals, or DOAJ, or DOAJ. For specific disciplines, for example, the life sciences, then there are famous international indexes like PubMed Medline, APA PsycInfo, CINAHL for nursing, and Embase and CAB abstracts for biology. So some of these are indexes of the journal itself, some are indexes of the abstract. Sometimes they give you full text. Other disciplines include indexes called Agricola, GeoRef, Hero, IEEE, Project Muse, SOC Index, ERIC, EconLit, LexisNexis, and SciFinder. So these include agriculture and economy, economics, and geography. There's also regional indexes for journals, for example, SciALO in South America, African Journals Online, and ASEAN Citation Index in Asia. Something else to do with indexing that we expect for worldwide standards is that journals have an ISSN number, or International Standard Serial Number, or they use DOIs for their files online. So these are digital object identifiers. We expect not just the journals to put up Word documents and PDFs, but to actually have online active coding, so XML, extensible markup language, or at least HTML on their websites. And they have article metadata that describes the articles. And we expect there to be a permanent archive of the journal so that if the website goes down one day, the records are still there. There's also international standards for ethics and international rules and guidelines in research ethics and research publishing ethics. So these include the Declaration of Helsinki, which say that you need to have ethics approval before starting a human experiment, and you need consent from human participants, whether they are human volunteers or patients, for actually participating in the research, but also for publishing their information and for sharing their anonymous data. So you need a permission, written consent from the human participants first. Now, a few organizations worldwide, including two I've mentioned already, COPE and DOAJ, have 16 principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing, which international journals are expected to adhere by. For journals accepting papers on clinical trials, those trials have to be registered online beforehand, and increasingly the data have to be registered as well. And for studies involving humans, animals, and the environment, we expect the researchers to adhere to international guidelines on safety. We also expect journals to have international editors, to use a high standard of peer review and to adhere by peer review ethics, and to clearly state their acceptance criteria, which could be just the technical quality of a paper, or for highly selective journals, also the potential impact, novelty, and importance of the research. Journals need to be clear on their authorship criteria and their publishing schedule and publishing ethics, including things like author or reader fees, journal information guidelines for authors, and copyright and licensing. International journals also have an international quality of reporting, so not just the English language, but the content. For example, the ICMJE, or International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, has special guidelines, commonly known as the Vancouver Guidelines. The Equator Network Guidelines ensure complete reporting of life sciences and social sciences articles, and there are now some methods, checklists and guidelines that journals are starting to use, and they expect you to submit a checklist with these items showing that you've adhered to the guidelines. So there's STAR methods, MDAR, and JARS guidelines. And increasingly, journals worldwide are using the top guidelines for transparency to promote open science and open research, such as transparency in the level of data sharing and protocol sharing. And for human studies, journals ask authors to adhere to the ICH Good Clinical Practice, GCP guidelines, and the Good Publication Practice, GPP guidelines. Other than that, we expect international journals to have good policies on data and metadata, to require authors to declare whether data are available or not, and to share protocols, and to have things such as registered reports, where some journals will peer review the protocol before the experiment is actually done. So this ensures that the acceptance doesn't depend on having positive results. And finally, there's also international style. So this does touch on the English standard. So there are style books which journals will use, and these are put out by the, for example, American Medical Association for medical style, the APA for psychological style, and ASA for sociological journal style. For modern languages, there's MLA. And for chemical and physical and other disciplines, there are also some international guidelines for full reporting and the use of English. For example, ACS, IOP, AIP, IEEE, GSA, and AGU. And generally, there's something called the Chicago Manual of Style, and for science, the Council of Science Editors style. So journals will pick a style, and if you know what style book they use, then if you get your manuscript closer to that style, then it will have a higher likelihood of being accepted. Other things to notice are the choice of style for referencing that journals make. They may choose the Harvard or name year style or the Vancouver numbering style. They may choose UK or US spelling. They'll have rules about numbers and units, figures and tables, the structure of the abstract and the article, and their own preferred words and phrases. Now, we've looked at how to identify international journals, but in general, they will have these properties. The publisher or society might be an international one or internationally known and famous, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a national or local society, but it has international standards and has international editors, reviewers, and readers. The journal will have international topics and encourage authors from around the world, and they'll encourage reference lists to include references from different countries to again show a spread and international importance for that journal. There'll be international ethics standards that we've just seen, and reputation and indexing, and international reporting quality and style, production and website quality, and the English quality. So this is what we'll be focusing on in this webinar. So be careful, because some journals claim they are international by simply having the word international in their title. So be careful of predatory journals which cheat authors of their intellectual property and money, and then you can't publish in a proper journal. So these look like journals that you know. They might have the name of a famous journal, but it has a bogus website, and then you end up submitting your paper to the wrong place. So look at the checklist in thinkchecksubmit.org, and that will help you identify trustworthy journals. And just always check you have the real journal and the real website that you're submitting to. Similarly, if you're attending a conference, whether it's a real one or an online one, be careful of predatory conferences which try to cheat authors of their money and their papers. So these are con with C-O-N conferences, so they try to con you or scam you. So there's a website similar to Think Check Submit, and it's called thinkcheckattend.org, and there's a useful checklist of what to look for trustworthy conferences. Now, I mentioned COPE before. So COPE has 10 core practices, which are policies and practices required to reach the highest standards in publication ethics. And these include things like allegations of misconduct, conflicts of interest, data and reproducibility, and peer review processes. So again, trustworthy journals will be members of COPE, and they will promise to adhere to all 10 core practices. Now, something else to think about for international journals is the content. What is international research? So international journals will look at these factors: the timing, the reach, the application, the consequences, and the knowledge type of your article. So if you notice, the first letter of each word spells track. So you have to be on track for an international journal to claim that your research is internationally important. So T stands for timing, and your work will be more likely accepted by an international journal if you address an urgent problem that has an immediate use and has both short-term and long-term usefulness for the world. R stands for reach, which means that it will be useful for certain populations which are going to apply all over the world, for example, young children or the elderly or patients with diabetes, or even, for example, Japanese patients or Chinese patients, because these populations are found in every country. Or your work could really reach everyone and everywhere. For example, it could be COVID-19 pandemic research. A stands for application. So your work has to be useful for something practical, such as services and products, or improving practice, policy, or laws, or improving education and research in the future. C stands for consequences. So again, work would be useful to have a practical impact on health, well-being, the environment, socioeconomic, and cultural issues. And the knowledge has to suit international audiences too, so match the language, the amount of explanation that's needed for the audience, the level of technicality. And for expectations such as whether data should be shared, whether code and software should be shared. So usually those would be shared worldwide. But also remember to always adhere to journal guidelines. They should be able to tell you what types of research that they accept and what counts as international. And there's one final thing, you may have seen this, the 17 SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So in your cover letter or in your research, if you highlight that your work is of value to the world because of the SDGs, that you'll fulfill one of those aims, then again, it will be more likely to be accepted by an international journal. So these development goals cover economic, social, environmental, cultural, educational, and human rights aspects of sustainable development around the world. So now we've looked at what international means and how to match your work to an international journal. Now we will look at what type of written English to use. English is the global language of science. So let's see what style we should use. So for this next slide, if you agree that these headings are suitable for an academic journal, then use the hand tool to put your hand up. So if you agree these are okay for journal style, if you don't think they're okay for journal style, then use the chat box and tell me briefly why they're not suitable. So someone's written there's a long dash. It is possible to have a dash. It's just a style thing. It could have been a colon, but yeah, sometimes a dash is seen as less formal. So yeah, so there's something to do with formality. So other than punctuation, the language itself seems too informal. And yes, you're right. It looks like newspaper article headings. So you'll see that there are some casual, non-academic terms like lightning fast quest. We wouldn't see that in a journal article. Mix and match, neighbors, what scientists know so far. So we wouldn't write that in a journal article. So this was a bit of a trick question because yes, you're right, they're news article titles, but they actually do come from Nature. They do come from a journal. So even academic journals will have casual titles, but in the news sections. So if we look at journals, so it could be Science, Cell, BMJ, other journals that have news sections, The Lancet, they might have this type of title. So if you're writing for the general public, you might use this type of language, but for your articles, actually, this is what you would be more likely to find. So structures and distributions of SARS-CoV-2 spike proteins on intact virions, SARS-CoV-2 reactive T cells in healthy donors and patients with COVID-19, aerodynamic analysis of SARS-CoV-2 into Wuhan hospitals. So very specific scientific names, scientific terminology, long words. So you can see the style is different between research articles and news articles. But we need to describe or be aware of what is the different style so that we know how to write it ourselves. So we need to look at English language rules, and when we're writing, the simplest level of rule is the syntax. So that's the spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So yes, you can use spell check, but it won't help you in all cases, especially if you've simply used the wrong word. But above the word level, there's going to be sentence level and the meaning of words. So that's called semantics. And that will be how the words stick together to form sentences. So cohesion and meaning. And above that is pragmatics, which is the real meaning intended by the writer for the audience. So this will be the logic, the coherence, what story you're trying to tell, do all the sections hang together and tell a consistent story. So we're building from the foundations upwards, and each of these levels has their own rules, but it's becoming more common that journals actually don't copy edit articles anymore. Most of them will, but new online journals may not copy edit your work. So you'd have to do all this checking yourself. Again, you can't just rely on spell check or grammar check. So get a colleague to help you check your work. But the most difficult and important level is the top one. Overall, the style, register, and genre, which is the difference between the news headings and article headings in the last slide, this will determine whether it's suitable for the audience. So it's like you're giving a lecture to the audience, but you need to know beforehand what level of language and knowledge that the audience has, and then you can gear your text towards the right audience. So this higher level, discourse level, is for effective communication. Now, even though I showed it's one way, and when we do write, it's for one way, it's for the reader, we don't see the audience. But we still have to think of two-way dialogue, two-way communication, because a research article is actually part of a conversation. It's a long-term asynchronous conversation. Someone will read your work in the future and they might respond to it in a different way. So it's not really in real time. They might write a letter to the editor. They might write comments online. They might do their own research and then cite your work saying what was right about it or what was wrong about it. So that's part of the long-term conversation. So you need to be able to be part of that conversation and to use the right language to be respected and to respect your audience. So it's like a secret language within a club or community, and you need to know how to address your community. In a similar way, it's different from whether you're writing something and whether you're speaking. So if you present a poster, you would use slightly more informal language compared with writing. And for example, if you speak to your university thesis examiner, you'll use different language, more polite, formal language than you would with, for example, your family. So the different styles of communication are important. So for writing for journals, you're going to need formal, planned, and written language, as opposed to informal or unplanned, spontaneous language. So when you correct your work, or you ask a colleague to correct your work, make sure they do know the discipline and they do know academic style, because the text could be grammatically correct, but the wrong style. So let's have a look at how to correct this. So this sentence has spelling and punctuation mistakes and grammar mistakes. So imperative, of course, starts with a vowel sound, so it should be an imperative, and we don't normally say is this at the end of a sentence. And shoot sounds a bit weird. Is it a noun for plants, for shoots? And why is it a question? So let's try to correct this and put the this at the beginning. So this is an imperative, and imperative in grammar means it's a command verb. So we have a colon and then we say get shot ASAP. So we know ASAP means as soon as possible. And then the verb get is a command. So that's an imperative. So we've corrected the grammar and punctuation, but we don't really know what this means. So remember, we go from syntax to semantics. So we need to look at the proper meaning. And actually, imperative has two meanings. One is the command verb form, but the other meaning means actually something's just important to do. So it's important. It's imperative you get a shot as soon as possible. So here we've tried to correct the meaning to make it more understandable for the audience. And we've said we've expanded as soon as possible, and we've defined that the shot is a shot. So it's not going to be a gunshot, but we can clarify it more if we define the shot. We know now in the pandemic it's going to be a COVID shot. So it's important some people might not know the word imperative, especially because it has two meanings. So maybe we can change it to say it's important you get a COVID shot as soon as possible. Now that would be informal style because of the contraction it's, and COVID isn't quite accurate. So we could make it formal and more written style if we say it is important, and then we fill in the little words. It is important that you receive. So rather than get, which is a very informal short word, so receive, and it's not really COVID, it's COVID-19. And what type of shot? It's a vaccine shot. And then we can replace shot with a formal word, injection. And then as soon as possible, we can define that even more. So it's better to rewrite it as, it is important that you receive a COVID-19 vaccine injection as soon as you can. So this is nice and clear for the audience. Now, if this was for a journal, we would have to make it even more precise for the audience. We'd have to explain what we actually mean, because you can't just tell the audience as soon as you can. And in journals, we don't use the word you at all. So we can rewrite it to really explain what we mean and say it is important that the majority of the population be vaccinated against COVID-19 as soon as a vaccine is approved and available. So that will explain that as soon as possible, it's as soon as it's approved and available, and it explains why it's important that people get a vaccine injection, because it's the majority of the population because of herd immunity. So you can see the more scientific we get and the more journal-like we get, the text actually got longer and the words get longer, and we give more explanation and we highlight specific parts. We don't use short words, we don't use everyday common words. So this is the type of thing that editors will do. So what is academic style? There's lots of things that an editor would have to remember to do, or when you're editing your work. So remember to change the words to formal technical ones. So there will be technical words like PCR that may not need expanding by a journal for polymerase chain reaction. So that's not the mistake here, but PCR analysis was done. Remember, so done is like the word get. Those very short everyday words we would avoid in journals. So we would change done to performed. And we wouldn't use emotional language and contractions like can't and didn't. And again, there's the word get. So instead of we sadly didn't get direct responses, we changed that to did not obtain. And instead of short words which have prepositions and adverbs like called off, we would have to replace it with a longer word. So instead of called off, we would say cancelled. Then, of course, in academic style, we make sure that we give evidence and support for what we say. So either evidence from your own data, or you cite research without plagiarism, and you give references, and avoid subjective terms and lots of adjectives and adverbs. So instead of hardworking researchers studying X cleverly showed Y, you would say researchers studying X have shown Y. Or you'd use the passive, Y has been shown, or it has been shown that Y. And then you give references either with the number system, the Vancouver system, or the surname and year Harvard system. And then there's lots of condensed terms and special names in academic style. So you'd find yourself shortening words and using a shortcut and naming everything. So scientists like to name things. So instead of a clause, whether or not a vaccine clinically works, you try to shorten it and use actually what scientists would would know better than the long version. They would just use 2 words, vaccine efficacy, and people within clinical science will know what efficacy means. You don't have to explain whether something clinically works. By definition, whether it clinically works or not is called the efficacy. So there are special condensed shorthand terms in science, so use the correct style. Conversely, if you were writing a layperson or general public version of an abstract, you would use the first version that's crossed out. Then instead of competently communicating, people in linguistics will know that you say communicative competence. It's the same words, but you use different grammatical forms for the noun of what the actual concept is called. So be careful, because in some fields and disciplines, there's a specific name for something like vaccine efficacy. So here it's communicative competence, not competently communicating. So something might sound right and it's grammatically fine, but remember, in English, there are lots of fixed terms in even everyday English, like fish and chips. We don't say chips and fish, or salt and pepper. We don't say pepper and salt. It's just always been like that. It's in a specific word order. So different disciplines also have specific word orders for their terms. Then here is where spell check won't help you, because you've just used the wrong word. The present systemic review, that should be systematic review. And even parts of your own paper, you can name. Section 3 describes, figure 1b shows. So even though it sounds like these are, you're giving human properties to things, it's okay for certain terms like figure 1b shows, section 3 describes, systematic review reveals. Then there's academic grammar. You'll expect quite complex and formal grammar, for example, subordination and conditionals. So there will be dependent clauses and lots of if clauses. If the sample had been larger, a definitive answer could have been obtained. So the tenses are very specific there for a hypothetical. Modifying phrases and adverbials. So you'd have a phrase before a comma to introduce a sentence to give more information about the time, place, or manner. So before drying the samples, comma, we removed all surface moisture. The word after the comma is going to be the grammatical subject. So it's we removed. There will be some sentences that use the passive. The results were adjusted for baseline characteristics. You don't have to say we all the time because it sounds boring. You might end up with lots of we sentences. So every now and then you can use a passive one, especially if you don't know who did the action. There's going to be relative clauses, a comma and a which. There were 30 positive samples in the control group, comma, which was an unexpected finding. And every now and then there might be an extra long sentence with embedding. And because if you split it into lots of short sentences, it would sound weird. So every now and then there'll be a long sentence. For example, a limitation of this study is the short test duration, which was unavoidable, as in all behavioral studies in kindergartens, because of young children's relatively short attention span. So we've embedded between a pair of commas and we've embedded between parentheses or brackets. Now, something else to note about scientific writing is, we saw before, we try not to have emotion or we don't say you, so we keep it precise, objective, and impersonal. So instead of our amazing discovery described herein literally proves that, so that's too many words, and also it has a subjective our amazing, so don't have too much self-promotion, so just say these results indicate that. And then vagueness, for example, the level was impacted by only just a tiny bit. So it's better to just actually give the precise percentage. The level increased by only 3%. Keep your work professional, technical, and correct. So the substance dramatically boosts breakdown and spread of stuff, has lots of vague words, and it's too emotional and dramatic. So just say the substance acts as an effective dispersing agent. Or here, there's ambiguity because there are two meanings. 5-year-old kids could mean 5-year-old children or 5 1-year-old children. So be careful that you really are precise and technical in your terms. Finally, we have to be unbiased, inoffensive, and respectful. So instead of naming people their disease like asthmatics and then using subjective words like suffer from bad nights, say people with asthma may experience sleep disturbances. So we need the neutral terms, the scientific terms. Instead of manpower, which implies that everyone who works as a man, we say human resources, staffing or staff, workforce or labor force. And then we don't offend people, especially people we're criticizing. So don't criticize people, criticize their work. The author stupidly forgot to define the variables. So for your readers, match their expectations, think about who you're writing for, because they might expect complex sentences if the journal is very specialist, and then they might expect very discipline-specific words and specific article structures, specific types of illustrations, figures and tables. The amount of evidence or data or explanation, again, will depend on whether your audience is a general one or if they are all experts. Be mindful of the reader's views and backgrounds. So if you know that your readers include lots of people who are hostile to new ideas, then you'll have to address their objections, limitations, and possible misunderstandings, but also give them more data to convince them of your point. And different countries will have different healthcare systems or legal systems, so be careful to explain what the system is in your country. Don't assume every country has the same type of system. And also avoid things like slang or jokes, because those won't be understood around the world. At the same time, keep the reader interested, so vary your sentence structure and length and complexity. Summarize, paraphrase, and synthesize. Don't just list what you found, or list things like author 1 found, author 2 found, or author 3 found. So do a bit of extra work to actually summarize similar things or synthesize an argument to help the reader understand the relationship between what you're doing. Don't just list everything. And then at the end, this is to remind you to vary the sentence style. So number 1, this sentence is simple. It's just subject and verb. Avoid sentences without verbs. So that's a sentence fragment. Number 2 is a compound sentence. So this sentence is compound, comma, for it has 2 independent clauses, and they're joined by a coordinating conjunction. But number 3 is this sentence is complex because it has independent and dependent clauses. So if you have a because, that's a subordinating conjunction. And number 4 mixes up number 2 and 3. So this sentence is complex compound, or it can be compound complex because it has 1 dependent and 2 independent clauses. So every now and then you are allowed a long sentence. Now, something else to help your readers with is to clarify ambiguity. So be careful, because in this sentence, it sounds like the heart rate is walking, not the patient or the person. So remember, if we have an introductory clause or phrase, the word after the comma should be the subject. And here the student photographs the participant with their smartphone. We don't know whether the smartphone belongs to the student or the participant. So be careful of this type of construction. Clarify relationships. So it's always between something and something, or from something to something, but don't mix them up. And then for either or, neither nor, make sure that the terms are parallel. So it's either as A or as B, or if you put the as before it, it's as either A or B. And when there are comparisons, keep the terms parallel either side. So higher in and than in, or higher for than for. And for ER comparative terms, make sure you put the comparator and name it. So patients in site A were older, but older than what? Older than whom? Older than those in site B. For lists, be careful that each term is parallel. So replies were collected, recorded, and analyzed. So keep the ED form for them all. And here the data came from diaries, interviews, and daily and monthly tests. So the last item is an embedded one, so make sure you put the extra "and" before that item. And explain abbreviations the first time if required. Some journals will have a list of abbreviations that you can use, but if it's not in the allowed list because everyone knows it, like DNA or HIV or COVID, if it's not in that list, you have to explain it. So we studied DNA, so DNA is okay as an abbreviation. We studied DNA sequences of CR hypervariable regions. People don't know what CR means, so the first time you spell it out and say control region and then CR. So that brings us to the last section on tips for writing research articles. So in the chat box, tell me what you think this picture is, because this picture will help you structure your articles. So as soon as you think you know what the picture is, write it in the chat box. Yes, a hamburger. Hamburger, beef burger, cheeseburger, or veggie burger for vegetarians. So why have we put a burger here? Because it's the burger model of IMRAD. What's IMRAD? It's introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Usually there's a conclusion at the end, which is part of the discussion or a separate section with a heading. And this shows that actually the methods and results is the most important part. So they're like the filling of the burger, and the different sizes reflect the size of the section. So actually the introduction should be quite short. And the sections could be combined, for example, results and discussion, but in general, research articles have all sections of IMRAD. We can also look at the same model for actual paragraph structure. So just within one small paragraph, we can call it treat. So T for topic sentence, R for reasons, E for evidence for and against, A for analysis, and T for the take-home message, takeaway message. So that's like a summary at the end of each paragraph. So the burger model is a useful one to remember. So the introduction should answer, what did you study and why? The methods is, how did you study it? The results is, what did your study find? And the discussion is, what does your study mean and how can it be used? Now it's a linear structure, but there's actually a full circle that you should think about. So the introduction is the setting and problem and analysis, but after the methods and results, the discussion should loop back and explain what you were talking about in the introduction. So you should be supplying the solution and evaluation. So readers will look for this full circle. So make sure you do answer the question, but check the validity and reliability of your study so you are answering the question. Don't confuse correlation and causality, and keep your variable names and messages and data values consistent. So if you are talking about particle size in the introduction, don't suddenly shift to particle density in the discussion. Now, the genre, the style for research articles. So of course, there's different types of articles like case reports and reviews, but we're going to stick to research articles because those are the important ones that concern us now. What looks like a research article will have to have the goal, structure, content, and style that suits an article, what the editor, reviewers, and reader is expecting. So the goal shows the value of your work. You should be solving a problem or adding to knowledge and arguing your claim with support. The structure would be what we just saw, IMRAD. Of course, there's usually a title and abstract beforehand. There's references and declarations afterwards. There might be extra sections, for example, a small literature review or relevant work after the introduction. There are going to be illustrations, headings, subheadings, maybe footnotes. The content we've seen should match the audience level. and it should be trustworthy, valid, and reliable. And then the style should be standard written grammar in formal language with statistics, equations, and some words allowed and some not. So you might be allowed I, we, and our, but you wouldn't be allowed you. And we would see hedging to be more careful and soften your language. So instead of is, we'd expect more mays and mights. Now, as well as just reporting your work, there's a hidden purpose as well in research articles. So this is why it's tricky to get the language right, and also the content, because of course you should be contributing to your field with high quality and relevant content without plagiarism, so that the reader knows the three what questions: what, so what, and now what. But you should also persuade your readers through strong logic, without exaggeration or bias, with support from evidence, and explain your value in your cover letter, title, and abstract. And then connect with your community, because I said it's a long-term conversation. So cite past relevant work, quote it properly, paraphrase it, summarize it, but be polite and professional when you're criticizing past researchers. And then for you yourself, you're trying to build trust and reputation. So include your negative results and limitations to show that you're professional and you have subject expertise. Cite your own work if it's relevant to show your past expertise, but don't be too self-promotional, and also think about SEO, search engine optimization. So include some keywords throughout your article so that you can be found and read and cited in the future. And then increase readability for your readers so that they understand your work more quickly. So simplify your work. So instead of omit by exclusion criteria, say the real verb exclude. Instead of make a decision, say decide. And instead of blood glucose level measurement methodology, say measure the blood glucose level. Delete repeated words and concepts. So facts are always true, result, meet, unique always means just one. History is always in the past. Red is always a color. And delete useless phrases like these ones. So do prefer shorter sentences and active voice, but also include some longer sentences and passive voice. Aim for variety. Don't annoy or confuse your readers. Include some signs and signposts and signals. So label your article well, for example, the title, keywords, headings, clear paragraphs. Give some signposts that point the direction of where you're going. Give the purpose, say figure 1, table 1, preview and review, warn when you're shifting focus, and introduce paragraphs with the topic sentence. Give some warning of where you're going, so justify or describe or analyze or compare and contrast or address objections, and do it in a smooth way for smooth information flow. So add logical linkers, use logical organization. So logical linkers include addition words, similarity, contrast, example, result, process, timing, and summary. So use these phrases. Don't overuse them. You don't need one for every sentence. And finally, like going to a new country and learning some phrases, there are going to be some key phrases that you will use for different parts of IMRAD. So the introduction will have a problem statement, a knowledge gap, a hypothesis and purpose, and some disciplines allow you to preview the content. The methods will have the approach and analysis. The results will talk about your sample and your findings. And then the final model. The discussion will have a summary of your findings, followed by an interpretation, comparison with the literature for context, and then limitations, and then your final conclusion. So use some expected phrases throughout your work so that the reader knows where they've reached. So this is like giving them signs and signals and signposts. Okay, so we have 10 minutes now for questions. We've looked at what international journals, what it really means, what type of English to use, and then some tips for the language of research articles. So please type in the question and answer box your questions, and I'll try to answer them. So we do have a question. Is there a disciplinary difference in terms of the preference for using the passive voice? In social sciences, passive voice is not really encouraged as far as I'm aware. That's a good question. There isn't a disciplinary difference. It just depends on what you're trying to say. If you look at those journal guides, either the guidelines or those international style books like AMA, APA, those actually do say prefer active voice. So it's a trend to prefer active voice because it's more direct. But every now and then you will have to use passive voice because you don't know who the doer was, or the doer changes, or it doesn't matter, or you don't want to blame the doer. So the famous example of mistakes have been made. You don't want to say who made the mistakes. So it's not really any specific discipline that has one more than the other. So use a balance, use it when you have to. Also, sometimes if you're talking about a topic throughout a paragraph, for example, you're saying Christopher Columbus sailed around the world, then your paragraph will all be about Christopher Columbus and what he did. So sometimes to make the sense flow that you want to talk about Christopher Columbus, you might have to use some passive sentences so that you're putting him at the beginning of the sentence rather than at the end. So sometimes to control your topics, you might have to use passive voice. That's a very good question. So there is no rule of either one or the other. It takes a lot of practice. Read a lot of papers and get the hang of using a mixture. There will be a recording available at the end, and AsiaEdit will email you to tell you how to access the recording. Or someone's written in the chat box. So do write your questions in the Q&A box, but I have found your questions. Is there a rating list of journals? It depends what you're wanting to look for ratings. So the JCR, Journal Citation Reports, is going to just be how often journals are cited. That might be useful to you or not, but there's a movement worldwide that tries to encourage people to stay away from impact factor for their own purposes, for appraisal purposes, and for individual articles, because it's a journal level metric. So it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for rating for how transparent journals are, then there's the top guidelines and top factor, which is an alternative to impact factor. So if you want to know how ethical, how transparent a journal is and how much it's promoting open science and open data and open research to put forward, for example, the SDG goals, so how good a journal is at helping humanity, then there's the top factor, top rankings. There's going to be other things like readership, how many downloads. There's altmetrics as well now for how many times an article is cited by different sources. But don't just overemphasize citations. Does each journal have its own guidelines? They should do. So that's a mark of a good journal, a trustworthy one. They should have transparent guidelines for how they work, what their peer review model is, what the author instructions are, how long peer review takes, things like that. So good journals should have their very clear guidelines. Okay, someone's asked, when I write the methods part, should I use the present tense or past tense or present tense? That's a very good question, and it's a complicated answer, which is why I didn't really touch on it. So there's a simple answer that many teachers will teach, that the methods uses past tense, the results uses past tense because your experiments were done in the past. So that's a good general rule if you actually went into the field or went into the lab and did experiments in the past. So these have happened. So you would use simple past tense. However, there are some disciplines and some study types where it's not really an experiment, but it's more a theoretical paper or a computing or simulation or algorithm or some kind of proposal paper or argumentation paper. So some disciplines, if they're not direct experiments done in the past, then they actually use present tense for everything. So they will, for example, if they're trying to prove a mathematical equation, they'll use present tense because it's not really an experiment. Revealed to the reader in real time as they're reading. So this is the reader's time, it's not the past experiment time. So in that case, it's a present tense because the reader is reading along with the evidence. So it really depends on discipline and study type. Apart from methods, though, the tenses will vary. So in the introduction, if you're talking about past work from other people, then you'll use past. But if that work is still relevant to today and it's a worldwide universal fact, then it becomes present tense. Similarly, in the conclusion, if you talk about your own results, then it's past tense. But if you talk about the implications and conclusions, then you use present tense because you're now claiming a new fact for the future. So your conclusion and implications will be in the present tense. So it's a complicated thing. So again, read lots of papers, and it depends on your actual message. We have time for 2 more questions. So someone's asked, I have heard that some journals are ranked A, B, or C. How do I know that my paper will fit A, B, or C? I don't know what that means, A, B, or C. I've not heard of it. Whether it's going to be some university-based system. There is Q1, 2, 3, 4, which is again according to impact factor or citation metrics, because they just divide it up into 4 quarters of journals in the rankings. And then some universities want people to aim for Q1, Q2, but I've not heard of ABC. Okay, I'll go back to the question box. Maybe this is the last question. Is it okay to write 2 sentences after because? For example, I did not go to school today because it was raining and today was a national holiday. So that's 2 independent clauses after a because. If you give, it's not really like whether you're allowed 2 sentences or not. It's more like how many reasons. So if you have more than 1 reason, then of course you can add it to the because. So that's perfectly okay if you have more than 1 reason. For the sense, if 1 reason outweighs another one, then you might have to redo the grammar, because you're trying to help the reader understand your point. If you're trying to emphasize one point more than the other, rather than just saying there are 2 reasons. Again, remember that's the listing. So don't just list what you want to say, try to help the reader. So you could say, I didn't go to school today because it was raining, and then you can kind of add, besides it was a national holiday. So you can kind of add some humor, add some extra meaning to what you're saying, rather than just list 2 different reasons. Oh, someone's written, please do another webinar on grammar. Yes, we can think about that. If you email the email shown, you can give us your requests. Okay, I think I've covered the questions in the question box as well as in the chat box. Okay, so I hope you've learned what academic style is and what international journals expect. It is tricky. It takes a lot of practice. Read a lot, get your colleagues to help you. Make notes whenever you read papers and you find an aha moment that you've realized what tense to use and what part, or if you have some favorite phrases to use. So just keep going, read lots of papers, get lots of practice. So our hour has come to an end now, so I'd like to thank you for taking your time in joining this webinar, and the recording will be made available in due course. You can find other webinars and free educational resources at the AsiaEdit.com website. I hope you found this webinar useful, and until next time, I wish you success. So goodbye and stay safe.